So Great Britain and France, and to a lesser extent Spain, um, were constantly fighting for power, and sometimes literally fighting. And France and Great Britain remained in wars all over the world. Now, the iteration of this long-standing war in North America was called the French and Indian War. Called that because the French were the opposing side, and because many tribes were enlisted and actually got involved, picked sides, fought, scouted, sold goods to the various sides, and so they were very involved. You know who else was involved? Colonists were involved. In fact, George Washington was a colonel, was eventually promoted to the rank of colonel during this war. But the war itself was costly. Wars cost a lot of money. They cost a lot of lives. They cost a lot. And so Great Britain was trying to recoup some of their finances that they had lost. And they figured English subjects pay taxes. So this is what we're going to do. We are going to charge taxes on goods that come to the colonies. The Sugar Act was passed in 1764. It placed taxes on sugar, wine, coffee, and other products that usually came from Caribbean islands that were also controlled by Great Britain. Now, it had not only been costly to Great Britain, it had also been very costly to the members of the colonies who had rallied themselves and had fought really without much acknowledgement, but had fought in this war as well. So there was quite a bit of resentment, to say the least, when Great Britain said, oh yeah, by the way, these goods are now going to cost more money because there's an extra tax on them. And to add insult to injury, they hadn't consulted with, they hadn't explained why or how they were, why primarily they were going to be charging these taxes. The next year, Great Britain came up with, and this was Parliament, with the approval of the king, but Parliament was saying, got another great idea, another way to raise revenue. We're going to sell a stamp. And basically any paper items that are put into circulation cannot go in legally be put into circulation without this stamp that you have to purchase. And you can purchase it from our governors that we've placed in the various colonies. So it's illegal to circulate cards, books, newspapers, basically any paper product, if it didn't have this stamp on there. And of course, that meant that circulation of all these goods was going to cost more because you had to pay for the stamp. And you would also pass that cost through to the members of the colonies that were purchasing these items. And it just did not sit well with these colonial assemblies who had come from a tradition where you actually had a representative in Parliament that was going, no, you shouldn't be doing this to our people, or let us negotiate a rate. And so that you started to see little protests, and the protests were basically saying, treat us like English subjects. If you're going to be taxing us like English subjects, then treat us like English subjects, let us have some representation in Parliament. And that was the primary refrain. No taxation without representation. And those were the titles of the marches, or what people would be saying. Now, have two pictures. The guy on the left with, I'm sorry, every picture that I have ever seen of him always shows him with these little short arms. I call him short arms. This is Samuel Adams. And another guy named Patrick Henry, famous for the "Give me liberty or give me death" quote. These two gentlemen, Mr. Short Arms and Patrick Henry, got together and formed an organization called the Sons of Liberty. There was also a Daughters of Liberty that they discuss in the book. Now, the Sons of Liberty actually organized protests. These protests were often loud. Sometimes they were violent. Sometimes riots would break out. Sometimes they would take dolls that they had created and of royal governors, the ones that were selling the stamps, and they would hang them on stakes. They would burn them. They started to get louder and louder. And now these primarily started in the Massachusetts area. Samuel Adams was from Boston, to be exact. And the Sons of Liberty were able to convince lots of colonists to boycott these goods that were going to have stamps. So we're not going to buy them. So if we're not buying them and we're not using them, then there's no need for us to have stamps. The end of 1765, Samuel Adams went on a writing campaign, and he started writing members of other colonial assemblies. Of course, this was not just being felt in Massachusetts. This was being felt all over the colonies. These high prices were being felt all over the colonies. And 9 of the colonial assemblies actually agreed to meet with Samuel Adams. They decided that they were going to meet in New York City. And they called the gathering the Stamp Act Congress. So this Stamp Act Congress, and this is filled with bigwigs. These are elected officials that have decided that they're going to get together. They got together and wrote a sternly worded letter to the king. And basically they were listing, these are the things that are making us upset. You are really not treating us with respect. We really would like to have a representative. Don't just start imposing taxes without giving us the respect of talking to us about it. You really don't have the authority to tax us if we don't have the ability to have a representative there in Parliament. We're not talking about separating at this point. They actually said the words, "We remain loyal to the crown, to the king, but we think that there are some things that you should consider." The boycotts really started to affect merchants in Great Britain, and to be honest with you, in 1766, the Stamp Act was actually repealed. And the Sugar Act was revised. So they actually saw results from their boycotts, from their letters, from their riots. And it was because there was a lot of pressure on Great Britain to do what they could to get the economy going again. These merchants were losing money because colonists were not buying their goods, or they were getting them from someplace else. So, however short-lived, there was actually success in the tactics that had been employed by the Sons of Liberty and by other colonists and by the efforts from the Stamp Act Congress. It was pretty short-lived. In 1767, the Treasurer, Exchequer was the title, Mr. Townsend, decided that he was going to impose duties on imports, including tea. And so these items that they were getting from Great Britain were now going to cost more, and they were restricted to purchasing them from Great Britain. So even in 1767, there were instances where members of the colonies were not purchasing the tea. Not that they weren't drinking tea; they would buy it from Amsterdam. They would buy it from other countries, and sometimes it would even cost more. But they were making this point, so they were not buying these goods that this new duty had been imposed on. So let's fast forward a few years. Great Britain was doing its best to let the colonies know who was in charge. The Townsend Acts were still in place. There was general unrest. Great Britain sent soldiers to protect stamp agents, stamp collectors. And so they were really kind of ramping up their presence just to show the colonies you don't know who you're messing with. And so these soldiers were, in general, interrupting life. One of the things that really got under people's hides is that they would go and take day labor jobs so that they could make extra money. And at times that meant that they were taking the jobs away from laborers in the colonies. This all really kind of came to a head in 1770 when riot got started. People were in general angry and tired of the British soldiers. They decided that they were going to move toward the royal stamp collector's home. The soldiers' job was to protect. That's what they were there for, was to protect. And so they were basically in a standoff. Who knows why? But a British soldier got startled and gun goes off. And the colonists, the workers, were super upset. Now, the first person that was killed was a guy named Crispus Attucks. African American gentleman, actually, and he is widely considered to be the first casualty of the Revolution, of the American Revolution. Once the smoke cleared, 5 colonists, and these were Boston colonists, were killed because they were not armed. The British soldiers were armed, and boy, doesn't that have a modern sound to it. In the end, the British soldiers were put on trial in the colonies, there in Boston. And you know who represented them? A guy named John Adams. John Adams is Samuel Adams' cousin. But John really wanted to show how civilized and sophisticated they were in the colonies. That they could take care of and be fair to British soldiers in the colonies. The soldiers were eventually acquitted, but the people in Boston were very, very upset. And as they started to talk about the incident, they started to call it the Boston Massacre, as if they had just been innocently standing there, nothing had preceded it. It was completely unsolicited attack by the soldiers. This is an engraving that was used for newspaper articles, so they would send these out. And hey, it was done by Paul Revere, and they actually say the name Crispus Attucks. Now, I don't see. You tell me. I don't see an African American man portrayed in this engraving. And the picture tells a story. It tells a story of soldiers being ordered to attack and attacking um, innocent, um, unassuming citizens of Boston. They didn't even care that there was a dog there, and people were just mercilessly mowed down. And that was definitely the story that was going out through the colonies, and people were getting more and more upset. As time progressed, the committees of correspondence, led by who you think, short arms, Samuel Adams, kept up this writing campaign where they were talking about how aggressive and how oppressive they were. Great Britain was becoming, especially in port towns like Boston and New York. 1773, Parliament jumped back into the act and decided that they were going to give an even more restrictive edict. This time, they said not only is there a tax on tea, but you can only purchase tea from one company. One company, the East India Company. And so, after they gave this directive, this boat comes into harbors, and to be honest with you, it had been to more than one harbor where they would not let the boat dock. It actually made it into the bay in Boston. But when the royal governor told the men to go and retrieve the tea, they refused to do so. And the royal governor refused to let the ship leave. So it just sat there in the Boston Harbor. And of course, we know the story. This is one that is a pretty famous one. Samuel Adams got together a group of men. Now, whether or not they dressed up like Native Americans, we'll never know. But they snuck onto the boat that was docked in the bay in the evening and dumped all of the tea into the harbor. So let's just stop and think about how this played out. And I have heard this analogy. I think it was Professor Snaples that first introduced this concept to me, and it really got me thinking. Let's say that you are 16. You're 16 years old. You have a driver's license. Your parents have purchased you a car, and you have a job. So you have a good bit of independence, and you have some responsibilities as well. But you live at home. You're in school, And during the summer, you go to your mother and you tell your mom, want some I want some freedom. What is your mom going to say? Let's say you are failing in school, you got into a fight, you had to go to in-school suspension, and you get home, and so you're grounded, and while you are grounded, you sneak out and you have a little wreck, and that's how your parents find out that you snuck out. Your parents are going to be livid, right? Mom is going to be uh, ready to lay down the law. In reaction to what happened in the Boston Harbor, Great Britain, the parent, responded by passing a series of things that came to be known as the coercive acts. The coercive acts were meant to bring down the hammer on their child that thought that they were independent and really needed to have a lesson proved to them. So Great Britain was like, listen, your colonial government is dissolved. You can't, you can no longer operate. The colonial governor is now in charge. We are not going to allow, once we figure out who did this, those people are going to be taken to Great Britain to be tried. We are going to send more soldiers, and this time when we send the soldiers, you better find a place for them to live. And if you refuse to give them a place to live, it's called the Quartering Act. If you refuse to give them a place to live, then we will just commandeer some of your land for them to have a place to live. Nothing is coming into or out of this harbor until you pay for every cent of that tea that was dumped into the harbor. And so nothing is going into the harbor, nothing is coming out of the harbor, and you can't go and trade to the west. In fact, we are going to allow your sister, who never gives us any trouble, to trade in the West. It was called the Quebec Act. Altogether, these came to be known as the coercive acts. And as those letter writing campaign really started to get out, the other colonies started to come to the defense of Boston. They would sneak stuff in. They were trying to help them have some type of commerce, and eventually they decided that they were going to meet. They call that first meeting the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress met in September of 1774. There were 56 delegates there from all 13 colonies. Even Rhode Island sent somebody. At this First Continental Congress, they wanted to present a united front. They wrote what was called the Declaration of Rights and Resolves. It was a little bit more strongly worded than what came out of Stamp Act Congress, but they decided that they were going to collectively oppose the coercive acts. This is not just a fight against Boston. Now you have picked a fight with all of us. And they decided that they were going to establish a formal organization to boycott British goods all over the colonies. Once this document finally makes it to Great Britain, the response was actual battles. So they ramped up the soldiers, they were given orders, and there were battles in Massachusetts, in Lexington and Concord, about 30 miles away. These did not go well for the colonists. Number one, this was the Massachusetts militia. They were not well organized. Great Britain was the strongest, most well organized military in the world. So the militiamen were quickly defeated. But Great Britain was, if you read some of the letters that were going back, the diaries and the letters that were going back from British soldiers, they were like, these people are crazy. They don't engage in regular rules of war. People were shooting at us. Kids were shooting at us. Women were shooting at us. They were shooting from outside of houses. We would just be walking, and all of a sudden we would have to duck and cover. These people are crazy, and they're out of control. So it did prove the might of the English army, but it also proved that they could be shaken up because they were confused. The next year, May of 1775, the group got together again. This was the Second Continental Congress. July 5th, 1775, one last document goes out. It was called the Olive Branch Petition. And it was kind of a, don't you remember when letter? Don't you remember when everybody was making money and you just stayed over there and you didn't have all these rules and we were not fighting? Can't we just go back to that? Can't we all get along? Let's end the hostilities. Let's go back. Once the letter arrived, King George responded by sending even more troops and really starting to ramp up and let them know that we are not going to take this from you. We don't know who you think you are. If Lexington and Concord didn't prove anything to you, then we're just going to let you know that we are not going to take any boycotts. We're not going to take any resistance from little untrained militias in North America, in the colonies. So at the Second Continental Congress, people could see the writing on the wall. And so one of the first things that they did was said, okay, if we're going to have an army, let's appoint someone to be over it. Who do they call? They called George Washington, who had the most military experience. He had military experience that dated back to the French and Indian War. So they said, if there's going to be an army, a continental army, George Washington is going to be the commander-in-chief. They actually disbanded. They called the Second Continental Congress into recess, sent everybody home, and the question that they were supposed to be asking in their colonies was, can we vote to go to war? Are we going to declare independence from Great Britain, or are we going to keep trying to reconcile? They left there this committee of 5 people led by Thomas Jefferson, and their job was to write a declaration of war in case they came back and voted to actually go to war. Now, Thomas Jefferson had some experience with constitutions, and he had met this guy named John Locke. John Locke helped write constitutions, several constitutions, and including the one in South Carolina. And John Locke had this concept that he had written about. And he said, I just don't know that I am comfortable with the concept of kings having divine rights and people don't have any rights, that they just have to accept that God placed this monarch in power, and if we defy them, then we're defying God, so we must just do what this monarch says. He doubted that. He started to say, I think every individual is actually given some rights directly from the Creator that are separate from a monarch. And they get to decide if they want to be governed. They act right because they make a decision. It's a contract, actually. So you give up some of your liberty that is yours in exchange for having a society that works. It's a bargain for exchange. That's called a contract. Both parties give something, both parties get something. Now, what were you giving? As a person, you are endowed by your Creator, John Locke said, with the rights to life, liberty, and property. So these were what you had to exchange. So when Thomas Jefferson got ready to write this document, he starts paraphrasing this philosophy that John Locke was discussing. Had this been applied anywhere other than in some of the colonies? No, it had not. But here Thomas Jefferson starts writing, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That came straight from John Locke. These are, Thomas Jefferson wrote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It didn't make any sense to write down property because everybody didn't own property. So if you were trying to inspire people to fight, and you were saying that you had a right to property and people didn't have it, that wasn't going to be very inspiring. So he replaced that word property with the pursuit of happiness. Now, Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, writes in there that all men are created equal. He also wrote some provisions about phasing out slavery. That all got removed. And he finishes it out by saying that governments get their power from the consent of the governed. We give you power because we're getting something, not because you're telling us we have to. And if you are not keeping your end of the bargain, then we have to leave. It's the right of the people to alter or abolish a government that is imposing but not giving anything. Those were the basic tenets of the Declaration of Independence. Well, the delegates get back. They vote to secede. They vote to go ahead and declare war. New York abstained. And they got to working on the Declaration of Independence and finally came out with a document that the majority of people were happy with. And they put it in an envelope, put it on a ship, and it gets shipped off. I am sure that Great Britain was beside itself. What the heck are they doing? Who do they think they are? After everything that I have done, how could they ever think that they deserve some type of independence? But it's done now. There was one last ditch effort to negotiate in New York that did not go very well, and the war was officially on.